We've been trying to build peace for thousands of years. But if we're honest, all we've been doing is taking breaks from war. We speak endlessly about peace. We hold peace conferences and summits, and we talk about creating peace. But despite all of our striving, all of our talk, we don't really create peace. We haven't created a world of peace. And the reason I want to venture today is that we fundamentally misunderstand peace. There is internal peace and external peace. We misunderstand both of these things, and therefore, we actually don't know how to create a bridge between the two. With regard to external peace, all we really do is create circumstances that look like peace. We have truces, we have ceasefires, but the conditions that gave rise to conflict are often still there, just simmering beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. Again, we've taken a break from war. We haven't created peace. And for most of us, when it comes to internal peace, we actually do something very similar. We create what looks like peace by getting rid of conditions that trigger us. But the moment those conditions return, we get triggered and we lose our sense of peace. So we've not cultivated inner peace. We've taken a break from conflict. For so many people, particularly in the spiritual world, there's a sense that if we just created inner peace, then the world would somehow magically reflect that internal state and we would have a world of peace. But what would that world look like? When you ask people what a world of peace looks like, most people don't have a very good answer. Some sort of vague notion that we're all kind of happy. Are we all singing on a beach somewhere? Who's doing the work? What systems are in place? Do we have governments? Do we have laws? We have vague visions of a future world of peace. In this video, I want to talk about what it means to create internal peace, what external peace can follow from that, what is a world of peace, and how do we bridge the two? First, we have to understand the root of conflict, why we don't have peace to begin with. And that has to do with the fundamental structure of consciousness. The most essential core way in which our consciousness is structured is built on separation. We see ourselves as separate, autonomous individuals, not interconnected, not one, not from a perspective of non-duality. We see ourselves as different. Our senses tell us this. And we grow up developing a sense of this is me, this is not me. And what is not me is different and potentially a source of threat. We learn at a very early age that difference is threatening. And so we're rooted in fear. And for those who awaken and develop themselves and deepen their contact with a diverse array of human beings, we learn that difference is actually to be celebrated, not to be feared. And those who don't end up deepening their sense of fear, deepening their sense of separation, wanting things like uniformity, sameness, for the purposes of creating the illusion of security, the illusion of peace. That is the core fundamental structure. We all have it to some degree. It's a question of how much we've worked to undo it, to not fall into very rigid binary thinking, me versus you, us versus them, highlighting differences as a source of conflict, and seeing those differences as a fundamental threat, as some sort of existential challenge. And you can see this playing out in today's world constantly. All of the identity politics, where there's a rabid and unbelievable fear about certain kinds of beings, certain human beings and ways of being, certain identities, like the incredible fear around trans people that is built on fear. Now, a lot of the ideas that I'm going to be sharing with you today were developed in a book I published back in 2020 called A World Without Identity, The Sacred Task of Uniting Humanity. It explains the ways in which separation is woven throughout our social, political, and economic structures. Now, this is an aspect of spirituality that most seekers avoid. Most seekers pretend that politics is beneath them, they don't want to have anything to do with it, operating often, I'm sorry to say, from a place of deep ignorance and often fear about how these structures work And instead, it's easy to just downplay it as 3D consciousness, mass consciousness, etc. It's actually important that you understand these structures and how they are rooted in separation so that you can actually think about what a vision of a new world looks like. Again, not something that most people do. The reason is that our sense of separation fundamentally structures our social, political, and economic systems. All of these systems that govern and shape our relationships with each other are built on separation. And so we have criminal justice systems that divide people into innocent or guilty, create people who are criminals, who are literally separated and housed away in society, in prisons. And it makes it very difficult for them to reintegrate into society. We have political structures that are built on partisan politics, political identifications, where those identifications often are the most important piece as opposed to what the actual policy positions are. These are just a few examples of how separation, binary thinking, and that sort of us versus them, fear of difference, gets transmitted into our social structures. And this extends to things like nations, national borders, national identity. Who is part of a national identity and who is not, which is why immigration today is such a charged topic, because for so many people, their sense of identity is tied to a certain version of what a citizen looks like. And says, this person is not part of us. Then you have all of these debates about who's allowed in and who is excluded and whether to deport people. We even have economic systems that are fundamentally based on separation and fear, and particularly fear of not having enough, so that you have enormous people who accumulate wealth and use that wealth to accumulate more wealth, fundamentally driven by greed and fear, and therefore then have many more resources than they need, and many others do not have those resources. Then we have class identifications, the rich versus the poor. Now, these systems are in place fundamentally to ensure a certain social order. And we are definitely far from the sort of chaos that comes when you don't have functioning systems. I am in no way advocating any kind of anarchic belief that if you just got rid of all government and all laws, that everything would be peaceful. That is delusional. But these systems, again, don't really create peace. They manage conflict, but not perfectly, obviously. There's lots of conflict happening at the same time. Conflict is always reemerging. So if peace isn't the temporary cessation of conflict, what is peace? Peace is not something that we create. It's something that we recover. It's the state before separation, before fear of difference. Peace is actually our natural state. It is a state of oneness. That's why when people go through spiritual awakenings and they have blissful experiences, whether it's through meditation or psychedelics or some sort of energy work or some sort of kundalini awakening, that they experience a state of oneness, one of the qualities most associated with this is an utter sense of peace. Anxiety disappears. Peace is a state beyond identity. Paradoxically, peace does not exclude conflict. True peace doesn't require harmony. Because that state of peace is internal, where there is no fear of a threat to one's existence, conflict or disharmony isn't seen as a challenge to one's existence, isn't seen as an existential threat. And you will know true peace when you can be in the midst of what looks like conflict, what looks like disharmony, and you don't feel a fear of existential threat. That is true peace. Your peace, your sense of emotional balance is not dependent on those conditions. That is very difficult to cultivate. Most people don't. Most people cultivate, as I said before, the absence of triggers and absence of conditions. In other words, they create the conditions that are the cessation of conflict, and that gives them the sense of peace. The minute those conditions come in, whoop, peace is lost. So you have to cultivate that. That is a spiritual endeavor. And this state is not naive. You might think that that's naive. Of course there are existential threats. It's not naive. It's how you are relating to what is happening because it's built on a fundamental conviction that you are a divine being who is completely loved. And that whatever happens, including the loss of your body and leaving of this realm, is not the end. That is true peace. The true peace is not the absence of challenge or conflict in the way that many people try to bypass that, create the illusion of peace. Peace is that deep conviction, the feeling that you are completely loved and guided and safe and protected, even in a world that constantly tells you otherwise. And we see conflict, when you see conflict from that perspective, you see conflict as an opportunity, as a gateway for true healing, where you get to the root causes of such conflict, rather than just temporarily calling for a ceasefire or a truce, and then waiting for the conditions of conflict to erupt once more. The world feels more divided and more contentious than ever. And we have been witnessing incredible amounts of chaos and conflict in Gaza, in Ukraine, here in the United States. So it's understandable that for a lot of people, they'd prefer to just listen to the myriad channelers on YouTube who have pronounced it. There's a new earth coming. It's here. It happens next year. It happens in 6 months. Now, I don't know about you, but I listen to these pronouncements and I neither resonate with them. They don't feel intuitively accurate to me. But also, those deadlines seem to come, we blow past them, and there's no new earth here. There's something fundamentally missing in this, which is that there is no talk of what the bridge is between the internal peace that each of us on a spiritual path is endeavoring to cultivate and the creation of this new world. Again, it's almost like a form of magical thinking where it just shows up. It's just going to magically mirror what's happening inside and whoop, there it is. But what it misses, and this was a message that came through very strongly in this book, what it misses is what it means to actually create new systems of government, new systems of law, new approaches to criminal justice work, immigration, new approaches to money, how we relate to each other. And that is the deep work of spirituality. But what kind of systems are we going to be producing? And this goes back to a point I made at the beginning about the ways in which spiritual people often just want to ignore all of this stuff, to see it as beneath it, to believe that they've somehow ascended beyond it, even though their lives are deeply enmeshed in all of it. And I can tell you that you are, because you're here in this world in a body. You are constantly enmeshed in the world of politics, law, and economics. If you think otherwise, you're just deluding yourself. You're ignoring parts of reality. You're choosing to not be aware. Where people really demonstrate that they have not cultivated inner peace is when it comes to talking about these things. They may sit in a meditation cushion. They may go on retreats. They may do all sorts of things. Sometimes they're cultivating a certain level of inner peace. Then you get to the world of politics, law, etc., what's happening globally. The bigger the topics, then suddenly they get charged. They get angry. They're yelling. They're screaming. Or they're saying, this is irrelevant. I'm beyond all of this. We have to have radical honesty with ourselves about how we're engaging with the world. It's incredibly vexing. It can be incredibly charged. These systems that feel like we don't have power to change them. Therefore, there's a deep sense of despair or anger because you alone cannot. It does not rest entirely on your shoulders. Only your ability to relate to it, and to relate to it as consciously, as awakened as possible, understanding how these systems work, how they are reflecting the consciousness of the individuals who are participating in them. You get angry at politicians, and believe me, I do. And then I can understand, this is clearly somebody working out their trauma. And as painful as the harm that they may be inflicting on us is, there's peace in understanding the origin and the roots of why things are happening. From there, you can relate to all the systems that you interact with. First, getting aware, deeply aware of how all of these how deeply enmeshed you are. And then every time you interact with that system, doing so with the intention of shifting it slightly, improving it, being grateful for it. Whether you're voting, you're you're purchasing something, you're engaged in any connection with politics or the law, in any way, shape, or form, and you are all the time. But noting how you relate to it and bringing certain kind of energy to it with the hope that other people will wake up and have a similar relationship. Where are we going with that? We have to recognize where old systems, where our systems continue to operate in separation, and embrace new ways of thinking about them. And some of that involves undoing and repairing the harm that has done. That's why systemic racism, the legacy of slavery in our country, is so important to address and not pretend that we can just turn the page. We're going to be in a post-color world. That is a social version of you, an individual, bypassing your shadow work. You know that on an individual level, if you're just like, oh, no, I'm going to just turn the page on my past, that shadow returns. That happens collectively when we don't do the work collectively. And that's what's happening now. We're witnessing all of the return of the past, of the shadow of what has been done to others on a systemic level. Then we have to start imagining what are new ways of doing things. So one example of this is the movement to reform the police. And it went by and has often been called defund the police. And that got a bad rap because people thought, oh, you're just trying to take money away from police. You want fewer police. But at its root, defund the police, that movement was rooted in the idea of maybe police aren't the right people for certain kinds of interventions. What if we had somebody else intervene in certain situations? And there are good reasons why it was called defund the police that had to do with needing to reallocate resources. The point being is that was actually part of a new creative vision for how to do things. And that's the kind of work that has to be done. I think, how can this be done differently? How can this be done in the spirit of interconnectedness and oneness and recognizing the roots of why things happen? Which is why, for example, certain decriminalization of activities has been important for recognizing the criminal justice system isn't always going to be the right answer for certain kinds of behaviors. And other techniques of bringing people back into community are much more effective sometimes. Imagine if our judges were empowered to come to results that did not always result in guilty or innocent, or you're the winner and you're the loser. That there were other options available that balanced the scales differently, that led to different kinds of responsibilities and obligations, that the answer wasn't always paying money and imprisonment. It's just an example. The governments have experimented with giving a basic living wage to people to ensure that they're not homeless, that allows them to then pursue other enterprises and activities, be it art, etc. And those experiments have proven to be beneficial as well. That's an example of trying something different. Now, one of the messages in this book is that we're not going to have a blueprint for what an enlightened world, a world of peace, looks like. And in a way, that's a gift. Because if we were given a blueprint, first of all, because we're all unenlightened, we wouldn't recognize it. We would be like, wait, that's what an enlightened world looks like? And then we would try to build it and we try to do shortcuts and get there. And we would end up, because of our current consciousness, reproducing much that we already have. We'd be like, no, that's not going to work. We're going to do things different. We're going to do things the way we know. But we're not going to get a blueprint. No channeler is going to come along and suddenly, here's what it looks like. Oh, and it's coming next month. Not going to happen. You have to engage with this and slowly, incrementally trying, experimenting, and we're going to still reproduce separation, even as we get better and better. And we're continuing to make advancements, even as we are potentially ruining the planet by not addressing climate change and putting all of our hopes on AI. We have to accept that it's the effort to invent something new from the spirit of oneness, of interconnected, that is going to drive the evolution of our society, not the magical thinking that it's just going to show up. Even the founding of our country, which stood up in opposition to monarchy, where all the power was invested in a king, and created a whole new way of government, a constitution founded on separation of powers. That creation, which was an advancement, was also built on an old consciousness, slavery, that there are human beings who are lesser than. That's the paradox, that you can have an advancement that still reproduces old consciousness. And that's where we're at in the evolution of our society, is fundamentally addressing that paradox in the origin of our nation. So each new reform will move us closer to unity, even as we continue to reiterate certain conditions of separation, certain parts of our old consciousness. In that sense, I want to reframe what a world of peace is. Because it's not this vision of us all dancing on a beach somewhere where, I don't know who's doing what, who's doing the work, that there's no conflict. No, a world of peace is not a world where there's no conflict. Just like internal peace is not a place where there's no conflict. A world of peace is one in which we understand the roots of conflict. We understand the emotions, beliefs, the structure of consciousness that gives rise to conflict. A world of peace is not a world where there is no conflict, but is a world that meets conflict with a desire to heal rather than suppress, repress, or just go to war. They might not even see it as conflict. In that sense, a world of peace is a bit like being a bodhisattva. The willingness to come back and emancipate all beings, even though that task is impossible. And so that's its gift. Peace knows itself by being able to meet conflict skillfully. And that's what we need to create as a world of peace. People whose consciousness is so stable, they can meet all of these systems with that kind of balance and understand, and with a spirit of forgiveness and compassion and empathy, to then keep building a new iteration ever closer to unity, even though we may never get there. That is the path before you, to remain at peace even in the midst of chaos. This is not to deny the suffering and the pain that is happening. It is not to pretend that it's okay. There is space within you to feel the anguish of what is happening to people and the planet, and to hold peace of knowing that you are deeply loved. To build that space of equanimity so that you can meet the world skillfully, open-heartedly. And that is what it means to know peace and to create a world of peace. To know that you are a divine being, a spark of the creator of love in human form, and to walk through a world that is still learning to remember that truth.